Hi, in this video I'm going to be talking about sustainable motivation. How do we sustain motivation? Now traditionally there are two types of motivation, intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Now this was the very basic kind of concept in motivation, to divide motivation into intrinsic and extrinsic. Now the difference between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation is that intrinsic motivation is driven by interest, by pure interest, enjoyment. There is no external factors involved in being for you to be motivated. Think of a time where you just did things because you enjoyed them, because it was interesting, and there was no reward, there was no punishment if you didn't do it. It was just purely for the joy and interest of doing that activity. That is pure intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivators are things you do because of some external factors. There is some reward and punishment involved. For instance, if you don't do them, you might be punished. You might lose your job, or you might get bad grades. And if you do them, there is some reward. Maybe you might get a bonus, or you might get a raise or a promotion, or you get a better score. So extrinsic motivators always have some external element outside of you, outside of the intrinsic kind of qualities that motivate you to do it. Now, of course, this is quite a simplified version of motivation, but motivation is actually a spectrum. It's not just intrinsic versus extrinsic. It's actually a full spectrum, going from amotivation, which is like no motivation at all, to intrinsic motivation. So you will notice that we can divide motivation now into what we call controlled motivation on the left and autonomous motivation on the right. Now, controlled motivation, to put simply, is when you basically feel that your external environment controls your motivation. That's divided into two types of external or controlled motivation. One is external regulation, which is when you feel like you're doing things because you should or you must, because you've been told to, and there's some expectation of that to be done. And the other one is introjected regulation. Now, introjected regulation is when you have this should mindset, where you say, oh no, I should do this, I should do that. Maybe you're not really considering who is making you feel that way, but it's become a part of a language in your head where you feel that you should do certain things. So these are all interjections that you've created in your mind. Now, moving to the right, we start getting into the autonomous motivation. Now, autonomous motivation is when you either do things because you value them, they're important to you, they're meaningful, or whether that's what we call, it's important, it's what we call identified regulation. And or we do it because it's part of who we are. We actually fully identify with it, but it's integrated into our personality, into our lives, into our identity in a way. So that we can intrinsic integrated regulation. So you do it because it's who you are. Intrinsic regulation is basically a pure intrinsic motivation, which is you do it because you enjoy it. It's fun. It's interesting. So that basically is the highest level of quality motivation because of the enjoyment that you receive from it. All three kinds of autonomous motivation will elicit commitment and high quality motivation, performance, and well-being. So that's where we want to be. We want to be on the right. We want to have autonomous motivation. We want to feel autonomous and have a sense of autonomy in our lives to be able to operate in that level. And we generally want to move away from controlled motivation, which is external, extrinsic, and it's very much around compliance. It's basically ticking boxes or avoiding punishment or seeking rewards. It's also important to note that the controlled motivation generally is lower quality motivation, and it often results in stress and anxiety and lower well-being. And we want to kind of move away from that, and that we a lot of times it's the language we have in our heads of what we tell ourselves. Are we spending much of our day telling ourselves we should do this or we should do that, or are we telling ourselves this is what we want to do, we enjoy it, it's important, it's meaningful, and that's kind of the quality language you want to have in your mind. So I'd like you to reflect on that and see where you're currently operating and how you might be able to change the language or the internal dialogue or monologue that's in your head. How can you change it so that you can move more towards the right? So autonomous motivation is sustainable motivation, and what we can do for ourselves is to move towards autonomous motivation and rely less on controlled motivation. It not only increases and enhances our well-being and the quality of our motivation, but increases the sustainability of our motivation, and we will have more sustained motivation over long periods of time and sustained happiness and well-being. Okay, so here are some motivation activities that you can do now to get an understanding of where you are and what motivates you, and whether you are more autonomously motivated or controlled motivated. And you can do these activities again after you implement new strategies to move towards autonomous motivation. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.